High in the cliffs of southwestern Colorado, an ancient world still clings to the rock. Stone rooms, towers, kivas, entire villages built beneath sandstone overhangs, so dramatic they still look impossible. But behind the beauty of Mesa Verde lies a harder story, because these cliff dwellings were not only a triumph of engineering. They were also part of a desperate age of pressure, uncertainty, and environmental change. For centuries, the Ancestral Pueblo people built, farmed, adapted, and thrived here. Then the rains began to fail. And once the land stopped giving what it once had, one of the most extraordinary societies in ancient North America faced a disaster that architecture alone could not stop. This is the story of drought, survival, and the painful decision that changed Mesa Verde forever. The story of disaster begins with a world that worked. Long before the final crisis, Ancestral Pueblo communities had lived in the Mesa Verde region for centuries. They farmed corn, beans, and squash. They built pit houses, then masonry villages, then increasingly sophisticated communities spread across the mesas and canyons. This was not a fragile culture waiting to collapse. It was resilient, disciplined, innovative. People here understood seasonal rhythms, stone construction, storage, cooperation, and land management. They did not simply survive in the Southwest. They learned how to live well in a difficult environment. And that is exactly why the later drought mattered so much. Because when a society this skilled begins to strain, the problem is not ordinary hardship. The problem is that the balance itself is breaking. Sometime during the late 1190s, many Ancestral Pueblo people began moving into natural cliff alcoves. The result was one of the most astonishing landscapes in ancient America. The cliffs provided shelter from rain and snow, shade from summer heat, and positions that were naturally protected. Villages ranged from tiny storage rooms to great settlements with more than 150 rooms. But this move may also signal something else. A changing world, a tightening future, a growing need for security. Cliff dwellings like Cliff Palace were brilliant answers to difficult conditions. But brilliant answers only work as long as the wider environment still allows life to continue. A farming society does not fear every dry season. But it does fear what happens when dry seasons stop being temporary. By the 1200s, archaeologists believe life in the Mesa Verde region was becoming harder. Centuries of farming may have reduced soil fertility. Large game may have become more difficult to find. Population growth may have pushed the land close to its carrying capacity. That kind of pressure builds slowly. First, it looks manageable. Then it looks stressful. Then, suddenly, it starts to shape every decision. A little less food in storage. A little more worry in winter. A little less confidence in the next planting season. And for families living on the edge of uncertainty, small losses do not stay small for long. Then came the disaster most often associated with Mesa Verde's final years. A major drought from AD 1276 to 1299. For farming communities, drought is not just a weather event. It is hunger. It is fear. It is a future that shrinks with every failed season. Corn was more than food. It was planning, security, and the visible proof that life could continue. When rains fail once, people endure. When they fail again, people adapt. But when drought stretches year after year, endurance turns into calculation. How much grain is left? How long can children be fed? What happens if the next harvest fails too? This is where disaster becomes personal. Imagine a mother in the last light of day, dividing the remaining corn more carefully than she did the year before. Imagine a child asking whether there will be enough for winter. Imagine elders remembering seasons when the land felt more generous, and realizing those years may not be coming back. We do not know the names of these families, but we know they existed. Mesa Verde was not made of ruins when people lived here. It was made of homes, cooking fires, work, ceremony, and care. The National Park Service preserves a descendant reflection from T.J. Atzi of Laguna Pueblo describing Cliff Palace as a place where, if you stop and listen, you can still hear children laughing, women talking, dogs barking, turkeys gobbling, drums beating, singing, and cooking fires. That quote matters because drought is often told as statistics. But drought is always felt as family life under pressure. When food becomes uncertain, the crisis does not stay in the fields. It enters homes. It enters storage rooms. It enters leadership. It enters trust. Crow Canyon notes that the hardships created by drought and food shortages may have led to tension and conflict. The National Park Service education materials also point to increased social tension and the growing need to protect food supplies. This is one of the hardest truths in ancient history. Environmental disaster does not only damage the land. It changes human relationships. Scarcity sharpens fear. Fear narrows choices. And choices made under pressure are rarely gentle. At some point, every society facing disaster reaches the same unbearable question. Can we stay? For the people of Mesa Verde, that question must have been devastating. They had built stone communities in the cliffs. They had refined architecture, storage, ceremony, and social life in one of the most beautiful and difficult landscapes in North America. But stone walls cannot make rain. And no matter how strong a people may be, there comes a moment when survival demands movement. This was the turning point. Not a dramatic collapse in a single day, but a realization that staying might cost more than leaving. By the mid-1200s, migration south had begun. By the end of the 1200s, most people had moved away from Mesa Verde. That sentence is easy to say. But what did it mean to leave? To leave stone rooms shaped by your own labor. To leave fields tied to memory. To leave kivas, trails, and a sky you had watched your whole life. To carry children, seeds, tools, and grief into an uncertain future. Crow Canyon notes that the people of Mesa Verde likely moved south where rains were more reliable and where other Pueblo communities already lived. That means the story of leaving is not a story of disappearance. It is a story of survival. This is where the most common misunderstanding must be corrected. The drought changed Mesa Verde forever, but it did not erase the people who built it. According to the National Park Service, Pueblo and Hopi peoples are the direct descendants of those who built and lived in the communities at Mesa Verde and surrounding sites. When their ancestors left, they carried architecture, farming knowledge, art, belief, and identity into other communities. UNESCO describes Mesa Verde as a significant and living link between Pueblo people's past and present way of life. So the disaster ended one chapter, not the civilization. Mesa Verde versus drought is not only an ancient story. It is a modern warning. It reminds us that even brilliant societies face environmental limits, that resilience matters, that adaptation matters, and that survival does not always look like staying where you are. Sometimes survival looks like movement. Sometimes it looks like carrying culture forward instead of letting it die in place. The people of Mesa Verde did not leave because they were weak. They left because life demanded courage of a different kind. And that may be the deepest lesson these cliffs still hold. Disaster can destroy homes, but it does not have to destroy a people. If the story changed the way you see Mesa Verde, like, subscribe and share. And in the comments, tell me this: was the greatest strength of Mesa Verde its architecture, or its ability to adapt?